Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, evening, or good morning, depending on where you are. You know, this kind of events with the translation, it's a bit tricky with the IT, but I think we are almost there. So I think it's a pleasure for us to organize this panel after the 8 cut, shaping the way forward. As you have seen in social media, this event is organized by Eurodad, ActionAid, Oxfam, 11-11-11, and CNCD 11-11-11. So it's a collaborative panel between organizations, networks, platforms working on international development cooperation. And yeah, we are in a tricky situation. As you know, international development cooperation is in a time of dramatic changes. Changes are not always for good. In 2025, we saw the closure of USAID, budget cuts in rich countries. 1 month ago, also, we received not good news about the projections about what is coming. And next week, we have the OECD holding a conference to rethink the future of aid. In this context, decision makers are less receptive to our usual arguments to increase aid, to improve the quality of aid. So it's time to maybe think and discuss if we need a different narrative, if we need other players to speak. We need to keep trying new things because our message is not getting through. So we have also concerns about where decisions on the rules that govern ODA are made. And this is what we want to unpack and respond today, if possible, in 1 hour and a half. So I will hand over to the amazing moderator, Sara Islam, to guide us in this conversation. Back to you, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Javier. And hello, everyone across the world. It's really a great honor to be moderating this very, very important panel. As Javier has said, we live in a very tricky situation, a moment actually of deep disruption in international development cooperation. The numbers are stark, but behind the numbers of the 8 cutbacks, I think there's also something more profound happening. There's a shift in political priorities and a shift in narratives, and perhaps also in values, actually. So aid is becoming increasingly directed towards domestic priorities. We're going to talk about that. Issues like migration is being instrumentalized and is becoming more business oriented. So from donors to investors. And as Javier has said, next week we have the OECD conference on the future of development cooperation, the EU's never-ending debate on the long-term budget, especially the global Europe part of it is also happening, and there's ongoing G7 debates. And as Javier has said, today's conversation is really about what civil society can put on the table at this very, very important juncture. So we brought together a panel to discuss many parts of these issues, to explore this further. We will have 2 rounds of questions. And as Stephanie said at the beginning, please put your questions in the Q&A, and you can keep doing that. And my colleagues will direct them to me towards the end of the conversation. Let me just introduce the panel very, very briefly. Jean Saldanha is Director of Eurodad. Jean, welcome to this webinar. Marta Bekele is co-founder of DevTransformations, joining us from Addis Ababa. Sara Casadevall is Research Associate at the Center for Global Development in Europe program, and also on the panel is Javier as well. Jean, I'm going to talk to you. We've talked about how ODA, official development aid, is being cut back. Could you walk us through these slashes and these sort of erosion of the ODA that is taking place? And what are the latest figures, and how do you at Eurodad interpret what's happening at the moment?
Thanks a lot, Sara, for that question. It's a pleasure to be organizing this event together with our partners, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. Of course, it wouldn't be a surprise if I start with the most important headline figure, which is the 23.1% drop in ODA budgets in 2025. I think you've already heard about that in the media. Now, it's important to say this is not a minor aberration. It is the largest single year drop on record, and it already follows a historic drop from the year before. Of course, the US already is alone driving down about 3/4 of the decline, with its ODA falling by about 56.9% compared to 2024. The US basically is now the official record holder in being the donor making the biggest aid cut ever in the history of the DAC, confirmed by the OECD. But of course, there were significant drops in Europe as well. The point is, this is a development debt that the global North owes to the global South. The 0.7 target has been a commitment since 1970. In 55 years, only a handful of countries have ever consistently met it. And the 23 EU DAC countries only spend about 0.42% of their their gross national income on ODA. Now, this is in stark contrast to the 34 eligible NATO members who have exceeded their 2% defense spending targets, while only 4 of 34 DAC members have met their 0.7% target. The consequences are dramatic. Development and humanitarian emergencies have been documented. You've seen that in the media. Public services paralyzed, lives and futures destroyed. But the point is, the fact that countries can make their NATO defense spending targets at the rate that they have, compared to how long they have taken and not even reached a fraction of the 0.7 target. The point is this, that these budget allocations are not a reflection of financial realities, but they are political choices. And it's not just a problem of the size of the budgets. It is also a question of how they are allocated. Only 16.1% actually reach LDCs where the need is the most. And these countries are paying back about twice the amount in debt servicing, repaying their debt, which points to another kind of a system breakdown, which is the debt crisis. 13% of all reported ODA has never left rich countries. And this has been used to cover hosting refugees, to spend on foreign student costs, as well as to pay off, to cover debt relief. There have been much more loans than grants spent with ODA money, and the share of private sector instruments has increased while development budgets have fallen. And this points to the fact that aid is increasingly being structured to generate returns for investors rather than deliver services to the poorest. So what this all boils down to is that the system which rich countries voluntarily set their rules, measure their own compliance, do not face any accountability for broken promises, as we've seen very, very clearly in the last couple of years, is clearly failing the people in the global South. And this has been, rightly so, a criticism of ODA for many, many years. So it's not about whether or not the system is ending or should be done away with, but the question is, what do we replace it with and how? At the 4th Financing for Development conference in Sevilla last year, there was a strong call for reform of international development cooperation. Southern countries call for a say in how international development cooperation, ODA, is governed, what the norms and the rules set are. But unfortunately, in the final outcome, it was only the OECD that got a review, or rather managed to get a review of itself, and no further fundamental changes to the international development cooperation architecture. So now that this OECD DAC review is underway with this conference in Paris next week, it is of utmost importance that the process does not just glue up cracks and continue to build on rotten foundations. It is essential that the governance of international development cooperation is brought to the only democratic global space, which is the UN rather than the OECD. I'll stop over there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Jean. You painted a very accurate, rather grim picture of where things stand in regards to ODA governance, pointed to many of the very, very disturbing trends that we see at the moment. Marta, let me come to you and ask you, Jean has talked about the quality of the aid, but also how defense spending is rising and how the debt burden in many of the global South countries is on the rise. And from your vantage point of view, which of these trends worries you the most and why is it? And what should governments actually be doing in response in terms of how we look at the future and this reform and replacement of the current structures that Jean has talked about?
Yeah, of those you listed, all of them worry me. I mean, I'm not going to repeat what Saldanha has been saying. With the instruments changing, and now you hear of investment frameworks. I had an advantage of sitting in organizing a regional meeting, a couple of them actually, on development cooperation, And what we keep hearing is mutual benefit and investment frameworks. One thing is for sure, as Africans are treating this as a crisis that should not be wasted. No one is nostalgic about how aid has been, that I can assure you. What should worry me is what replaces it, When you hear that it can take a decade to rebuild Ukraine, for instance, you know what it means when how much went to Ukraine was the total amount that came to Sub-Saharan Africa, all combined, So we're not treating this as a temporary pause, a shrink in volume. No, this is transformation in terms of paradigm, as Saldanha said, in terms of values, We keep saying this side of the world, the mask is off, So we are doing away with the pretense that this was all about charity and solidarity. So that uncertainty, as I said, and then the investment angle of it, at the end of the day, you get to learn that capitalism continues to win. This is about profits of corporations. At the same time, what is happening here is physical trade-offs. We're not going to wait, for instance, external financing to come for us to do climate actions, but that comes as an opportunity cost trade-off with proper spending. For instance, we did an analysis of 10 African countries' budgets, and that's exactly what we are doing. If you take my country, of course, in Ethiopia, for instance, the health system is hugely impacted. Programs on food security, gender, reproductive health, even disability, to our surprise, have been, for whatever reason and whatever they connected it with. These are the things that we are observing. Climate financing coming as loans, even for adaptation. By the way, I had a very interesting conversation with a minister here who asked, yes, there are cuts, 23.1% last year. It's projected 5.8%, I think, this year to shrink. But how come it has not turned things upside down? How come people are not dying on the street, to borrow a famous line from a lady at some point during COVID? So we have to ask ourselves, Is it because the impact is not felt yet? Maybe in terms of health, for instance, health services. Or is it because some of these cuts and some of these shocks are being absorbed by the inefficiency and wastage that was there? So these are the questions that we need to ask. So the last question you asked was, what should governments be doing in response? We had extensive, as I said, we had a couple of regional meetings there, extensive discussions. Governments should stop treating this as a temporary disruption, as I said, but a structural shift. We are not nostalgic about old aid model, but a post-ODA reality. So one would be, of course, on DRM, the domestic resource mobilization. We're talking about stronger tax systems, but also looking at what flows out of this continent. You know, I heard a line, people saying that we should let aid commit suicide. You can't do that if you manage to stop the leakage, the bleeding from this continent. So in the grand scheme of things, you know, development cooperation, is it not about, you know, making sure that we tackle illicit financial flows, we improve natural resource governance, capturing the values here in the continent, so that it is not necessary. Governments blocking leakages, and I can mention there are several initiatives here in Africa for health sovereignty, for currency sovereignty, for financial sovereignty, even for logistics sovereignty. How does development cooperation come into play a role in facilitating this so that it breaks a structural dependency? I think that is the gist of it. And this should be the role of African governments coming together using endogenous capacity so that whatever aid or ODA, a component of development cooperation, would just be a lever, a catalytic kind of role to play, but not something that is permanent. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Martha, thank you very much. I think what you said is extremely important in terms of what African governments are doing and the initiatives they're taking, and, you know, using ODA perhaps as a catalyst rather than just overly dependent on ODA. I was just wondering, where are these initiatives, and why doesn't one hear more of them, about them? Why aren't they making an impact on this discussion? Because all of what you've said is so vital for the future of the global South, of Africa, and development and progress. Why are we not hearing more about this?
Yeah, it's true. They are sitting at the African Union. For instance, we have the Africa Medicine Agency that is for health sovereignty. Unfortunately, we have a continental body where majority of its budget is coming externally. So these initiatives are there. You have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, AFCFTA.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is not just about regional value chains. This is not just about trade. It is also about currency, where countries are going to allow themselves, you know, to trade in their currencies. So this is about currency sovereignty as well. The initiatives are there on paper. It is about pushing them and making them happen. So what is the role of development cooperation here? Is it to support, for instance, regional initiatives like this?
Exactly. Okay, we'll come back to some of the questions you've read. Sara, I'm going to go to you, and let's talk a little bit. Let's take a step back and look at how ODA is actually being provided by governments, and what are the kind of reasons for ODA. You've done research on that. And I think always governments in the global north feel a need to justify the spending on development cooperation and international partnerships to their countries, to their citizens, actually. So what has your latest research shown about what are the arguments that governments in the global north are using at this moment in terms of ODA, sustaining it or cutting it back?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sara. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this great panel today. So, well, from what I'm hearing from the other panelists, it's quite clear that the old model of development that we've been, that we lived the past decades has run its course, and we're really facing a new model, but it's really less clear what's about. And so I want to say three things that we outline in a recent paper, and I think hopefully with the idea to shed some light in this unknown territory. And so the first is that governments spend public money abroad for three reasons. First is human solidarity. Second is to address shared global challenges. And thirdly is to advance mutually beneficial partnerships. Second is that I'd like to highlight is that the case of ODA has been weakened because we tried to stretch a very limited pot of resources to address many different challenges. So we make the case that we need a very clear architecture of international public finance, and then really clarify what's the role of ODA within that. And then the third point that I'd like to make is that aid works best when it is spent for core development, for core economic development, and in the territories that the need is greatest. And onto the first point that directly answers your question, we need to be clear that framing international development just around serving national interest is a strategic mistake, and it falls short. Because if we frame aid just purely as self-interest, it becomes much easier and a much easier target to cut when the domestic needs increase at home. So, we think that there needs to be a more complete answer to that, and to be frank, more honest answer to that. And that's made of the three motivations and three reasons. Human solidarity, which the justification is fundamentally moral, and it's about acknowledging that everyone should live a life with dignity, and governments are responsible to make that happen the most effective way. And surveys show that there is sustained support for development in grounds of moral and solidarity. Then, to address global challenges, this is less of an altruistic reason, but it's more about rational collective action. A country alone cannot face the challenges of climate and pandemics. And also, it's a more cost-efficient answer. And finally, advancing mutual beneficial partnerships, which again, it's taking a lot of the narrative right now. There is situations where perhaps development investments might align with broader foreign policies, but these investments can create positive outputs when there is genuine convergence. The problem is that most of the time, these investments serve primarily provide their interest, and are just, what they claim is that this actually serve development purposes, which is not true. So governments need to be honest. And so, very briefly, beyond these motivations, we have a big problem to face, which is that for many reasons that have been outlined, ODA right now is being, like, the idea of ODA is being blurred, and ODA cannot be the answer to every global problem we have. So, we propose that we need to have a clear idea of what are the purposes of public development finance, and we identify three buckets. The first one is core development investment, and that's where ODA should be, focused on. And the aim is to reduce poverty and to support durable growth in partner countries. Second one is that of humanitarian support, and it's driven by the imperative that we need to save life and protect human dignity in situations of crisis. And the third one is about financing global public goods. That's climate sustainability and global health, for instance. And here the problem is that the scale of finance that we need to address those is way beyond what ODA, like the pocket of ODA. So it's just inefficient to attempt to use those sources. And then I guess to end, the last question is about, that we have this framework, how should we allocate ODA? And the argument that we try to make is that ODA should be spent where the greatest impact is made. And this means that ODA should be spent where poverty is deepest, vulnerability is highest, and where, like, other sources of finances are limited. So, I think, to get back to the beginning, we're definitely in a moment where the old model has crumbled. We're defining a new model. And what we argue, and I think where a lot of like the CSOs have a lot of importance in the coming weeks, right? And a big role to play is in pushing for a clear case for aid, because we believe that's the best way to defend it. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sara, for exploring this with us further. I just had a question about, the poverty focus that we've had in ODA officially for a long time, and now the focus is really, at least in the European Union, moving from poverty elimination to projects or initiatives like the Global Gateway, where the focus is very much on investments and returns, and the whole concept is completely different. And I was just wondering, is elimination of poverty, solidarity, and the issues you've talked about, global challenges, are governments, any governments in the global north, actually still sticking or adhering to those concepts and those ideas? Or are we seeing a global trend towards negation of these initial concepts of solidarity?
I think it's true that like what we are hearing is that we need to go towards more investment practices. We need returns. We need to make this case for self-interest. But I think that's wrong. And I think, again, as I said, a lot of the surveys show that the strong case for development still relies in the solidarity part, and a lot of the public still believes in that. But and I also think there is here a role to play. I think governments tend to believe that the self-interest argument is the one that's going to bring them more votes and convince the citizens that's the way to go for development. But they also have a role to play in influence the narrative. And I think governments should, and I think some countries have been putting that argument together, namely Spain, that there is still an important role to play for ODA, and particularly for grant resources, to alleviate poverty. And I think it's still some governments recognize that. And we should, as a community, we should push for that. And we should let governments know that it's not only about self-interest, that there is other narratives that are important and that we need to protect. Thanks.
Thank you. I think public opinion polls show that solidarity is still an important value for European citizens, many citizens in the global north. So your point is taken. Thank you very much. Javier, I'm going to bring you into this discussion and take the question to the European Union now, because as we all know, discussions on the new MFF, the EU budget, have begun, and they're taking place as we speak. I think night and day, it's on everybody's mind. Where does the European Union and the European countries, where do they fit into this picture? What would be the role of the EU in this new paradigm that we're talking about? I've talked about the Global Gateway, but maybe there are other questions on the agenda of the EU that you could explore with us.
Thank you, Sara. Before talking about the EU, let me talk about the European citizens, because I think it's important to remind that in the last Eurobarometer, as you mentioned, 9 out of 10 people consider reducing poverty in partner countries important. An equally large majority support the EU funding humanitarian aid worldwide. So it means that this support remains even in crisis time. So I think it's important to understand that the public opinion is supporting solidarity, supporting international development cooperation, supporting humanitarian assistance. The problem is that the governments and EU institutions are not following what the EU citizens are demanding very clearly.
Absolutely.
So going back to the EU budget question, if you go to Brussels and also out of Brussels, this is the main topic for discussion. Why is important this EU budget, MFF, for this international development cooperation? Because, EU and member states account for around 40% of global ODA. So at a moment of global aid system is under strain, with some donors cutting back dramatically and others remain reframing aid in a very narrow and transactional terms, the EU remains one of the few actors with both scale and rule-setting power. This means that whatever decisions are taken in Brussels will shape the aid infrastructure and aid framework. Unfortunately, the EU is at the forefront of these trends that have been describing Jean, Marta, and Sara. So, shrinking aid volumes, growing diversion of ODA to in donor costs, migration, refugees, and also a strong push to redefine development cooperation through the lenses of security, geopolitical competition, and investment returns. You already mentioned Global Gateway. I will not go into that, but it's a good example. So all of this makes the EU distinctive in setting the priorities for the new infrastructure for international development cooperation. What are the main risks? I mean, somehow they have been already described by Marta, Jean, and Sara. I see three. The first one is instrumentalization. So there is a mounting pressure for development cooperation to serve short-term European interest, migration control, access to critical raw materials, economic security, also geopolitical visibility. All of this is presented as pragmatism, but we know the story tells us that's not the right recipe for international development cooperation. It's also shocking to hear some of MEPs, even member states, talking again about tight aid. I think that was a discussion of the last century. So we are going backwards in that regard. The second risk I see is also mention the erosion of the grant-based aid. Now we talk about loans, warranties, investments. So we know all these tools can work in some contexts, but they systematically exclude the poorest and the most fragile countries and shift risk into partner governments and communities that are least able to carry it. And then maybe the third risk I see is the decentralization and loss of democratic ownership. This is also a basic in international development cooperation. Now we see more money being channeled through large EU managed facilities with less space for local actors, civil society, and partner country decision makings. Those are the three risks that I see. But there are not all risks. There are also opportunities in these debates, because in the end, this debate is about the purpose of the EU development cooperation. So I think we still have an opportunity to influence this purpose, because we know that the public opinion is supporting that the EU could also make a difference in poverty, equality reduction, climate justice, and supporting for democratic values elsewhere. So I think that we need to use that momentum to push the EU to reframe the purpose in the right way, and don't follow this new doctrine coming from other places, which is around Europe first and other countries first. You know what I mean. So that's not the value that EU can bring into the table. So there is a political fight about the purpose of aid that I think we need to play in that fight, because development cooperation should remain focused on human rights, public services, climate justice, among others. So we have also seen positive voices in the Parliament with this new report, amending Global Europe instrument. There are some positive elements. So there are positive voices pushing for the right thing, for ODA to remain focused on what we think is the right thing to do. So maybe let me conclude by saying that this debate shouldn't be confined to the technical experts, to the decision makers and the negotiators, because in the end we are talking about people, and this budget is influencing people. So we need people behind us, backing us, and supporting to defend the old narrative, which in the end is the new narrative, which is about supporting international development cooperation to focus on poverty eradication, inequality, climate justice, and supporting the priorities of the global South countries. So let's see if civil society were able to mobilize this critical mass of public opinion behind those values that I think represent all Europeans. Back to you, Sara.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you very much. I think there's a broader issue happening in Europe at the moment as well, which ties into what you've said. Basically, the disconnect between what's happening at the EU leadership level in terms of decision making and solidarity that people are showing for eradicating poverty, solidarity for Gaza, solidarity for people in Ukraine. I mean, the people in the streets, the demonstrations are a vivid proof that Europeans do care about what's happening in the rest of the world. My question to you is, these changes that are coming in the EU's philosophy of development, if you like, the concept of development and international partnerships, to what extent is it being influenced by the rise of the far right? Because in the European Parliament at the moment, the far right has become a very potent and a very vocal group on many, many issues to do with foreign policy and development policy as well. So isn't there a polarization, and is the influence of the far right becoming very obvious when we talk about business interests, when we talk about controlling migration through development funding, and repatriating people when they do not meet certain human rights standards, etc. So, your insights on this?
I mean, Sara, I think that the easy answer would be yes, it's the far right, the responsible for all of this. But unfortunately, I don't think it's only the far right. I think this tension and threats we have seen coming for many, many years. I mean, this tension between self-interest versus a pure and value-driven international development cooperation has been there. I mean, I remind the discussion about migration and the EU Trust Fund maybe 15 years ago with the Valletta Summit. So I think that before the far right gained a lot of traction in the last 5 to 10 years, I think those debates were there. What the far right has done definitely is just to exacerbate the existing trend about what the EU development cooperation should be focused on. But I don't think it's only exclusive of them. I think that there has been this growing tension between the self-interest and the value-driven international development cooperation for many years. Yeah.
That is absolutely true. I mean, I track this on many geopolitical fronts, and what you're saying is absolutely right. Some of the ideas of the radical right are being actually amplified by mainstream politicians as well. So thank you for that. I'm happy to start the second round. I've already asked you several questions in a go, but let's go into the second round as well, where we'll be looking more specifically at how civil society can actually influence the discussions that are going on at the moment at the OECD level next week, what's happening at the MFF debate in the European Parliament, but also the European Council, and then also, of course, the G7. And Jean, if I could come back to you, where do you think is the highest leverage entry point for civil society right now? What would be the messages, we've talked about them, the messages that need to be brought to the highest level? At the OECD level, what is the entry point for us as civil society actors?
Thanks, Sara. Before going to your question, let me comment on the point that you were just discussing with Javier.
Please.
I mean, development budgets are a soft target. I mean, for a lot of politicians, and I would not name a particular faction. They have been a soft target, as Javier says, for a lot of politicians, which use the us versus them, the migration narrative, arguing that the public purse is being looted to spend money, God knows on what, God knows where, those kind of things. And unfortunately, this has distorted public perception. So there is this interesting poll that we saw reported by the Financial Times last week, I believe, that was commissioned during the French G7 presidency in DAC countries. It was done in DAC countries. And it shows, interestingly, that as a result of this narrative, people wildly overestimate that their countries are spending 15 to 25%, even 25% more than they actually are spending on development. So there is this vicious cycle, which is, we know the critique. It is not working because there's just not enough of it. And that's what Sara has said earlier. And it is not being spent effectively. That's true. And I mean, there is a host of criticism. We are leading on that about ODA right now. But unfortunately, what has happened is opportunistic politicians, again, fuel narratives of money waste, and reactionary governments what they're doing, they are making the situation even worse by recasting the narrative to make it about how much they as a country can get in return for every euro that is spent, which is going into this whole return on investment narrative, which is a very dangerous narrative. Because you see, it is all about what do we get out of it? And that's recasting the whole discussion. And this is all that the G7 discussion is all about. It is all that the MFF is all about. And probably, I mean, eventually the OECD review will also boil down to it. But what is really needed, and I think this is coming to your question, what our message is going to be for the events that are coming up in the next few weeks is this. There needs to be an open and transparent debate about what international development cooperation is. And I think Marta really hit it on the head. Let's think about how international development cooperation can be a catalyst for the sovereignty that politicians have been kind of crying for many, many years since independence. And unfortunately, international development cooperation has not been. Let's talk about how to allocate that money correctly. Let's talk about how to use it as a powerful means to achieve international stability and prosperity. And that is what everybody wants right now. But unfortunately, the way they're talking about it is weaponizing their economies, about deeper militarization. And that's not the way to go.
Jean, just to take it forward, because I think we really come to the crunch of the issue, isn't it? What will this reform entail? And it's going to be a very uncomfortable conversation and an uncomfortable, let's say, looking inwards about the development sector more generally, what has gone right and what has gone wrong and what needs to change. And I was wondering, from the civil society point of view, are we ready for such a conversation ourselves?
We have to be. I mean, we don't have a choice. Like I said, I mean, there has been a critique of the colonial continuation of a colonial relationship with the development architecture, and civil society has been part of it. So it is, if civil society, if we ourselves are not looking, first of all, at ourselves and how we perpetuate those relationships, then it is high time we do. Of course, it is an uncomfortable conversation, but I would say that a lot of civil society organizations are having these conversations, and that is definitely very heartening. And if they are not, then it is high time they do. Definitely uncomfortable, but it is high time that that happens.
Yes, I think you. I have been part of these conversations, and I think you're absolutely right. They are taking place, but I would suggest that they speed up a little bit more and perhaps come up with a question for you, Marta, actually coming up with a more compelling narrative that would really include the concerns and the interests of the global South, but also ease concerns in the global North, that some of this aid, some of this funding is being wasted through inefficiencies or through what people say wastage or corruption even. Marta?
Yeah, I mean, that's fine, yeah. But I always reject the notion that corruption is the preserve of the global South. Corruption is everywhere. Look at the Trump administration. So,
absolutely, yeah.
To me, the assumption that the OECD is the one that will be, setting the agenda, driving this reform, has to be challenged. I mean, 2/3 of LDCs are in Africa, for instance. Are African countries, how are they being involved? For instance, if we purport that these are the major recipients. As far as I know personally, only the Norwegians have been collecting perspectives from Africa. They have written a white paper, which will be tabled in Parliament in a few months. And they are trying to gather such views. Other than that, it seems to be this conversation, this reform. What are you reforming? What is your incentive to reform? how does it speak to the reality and desires of African governments is unknown to me yet. The other is rejecting the depoliticization of aid language. I think civil society organizations need to bring back politics in it, because this is about power. It's about, as you said earlier, Madam Facilitator, you talked about military priorities. It's about migration and the politics of it. It's about strategic influence that these former colonialists had on African countries. So where is the politics of it? How do we bring politics? Because this neutrality and technical, when the OECD is driving this reform, it will tend to be neutral and technical. It's about data. It's about, this rate, that rate, but it is about political asymmetry. It's all about, institutions that work against our interests. So all that, civil society organizations have a huge role to bring back politics in this. Civil society organizations, movements should also refuse the narrow framing of how to save aid. I mean, even how civil society organizations, are we even on the same page when you talk about aid? There are those that are talking about saving aid. There are those that are already thinking about post-aid, and we don't want the old regime, let's form another. So coming together to understand and redefine what development cooperation means. And what else? I mean, this notion from donors to investors, the private sector, blended finance, and so on. Ultimately, this is about capitalism and sustaining and fixing capitalism. Whether you have the war in Lebanon, in Iran, and so on. Ultimately, this is about, that fix that capitalism needs all throughout history. So we need to push that back. But to just come back to your question, like, what are these messages in these spaces that we need to take for next week, or even after next week, is that development cooperation must be judged by the outcomes, like, is it contributing to breaking, as I said, structural dependency of the global north is one question. The second is, aid cannot be discussed separate from date, illicit financial flows, unfair trade, the global financial architecture, and so on. So it has to be within that context. When you make the talk about aid effectiveness, you kind of neglect the justice element of it. So we need to be very careful on that. And maybe one thing that I was thinking earlier when I looked at this question is civil society organizations, research think tanks here with us, for instance, they can establish how much is Sweden or Norway or Netherlands benefiting from ODA. This is a case that they can make for constituencies and taxpayers, for instance. So that is something that, but ultimately, finally, I want to say that civil society organizations, they should not make development cooperation ODA for the management, the software management of this unequal system. If it is true reform, then it has to lead to rupture. That's it.
Right. One question that is interesting also at the OECD level, I mean, there is an elephant in the room, isn't it? And that's China. I mean, the OECD, obviously, it's the Western donor countries. I think Japan, of course, is a member, and Korea as well, Turkey. But China is not. So when there is this reform discussion taking place, etc., one of the largest contributors to development in the global south is missing in action, is not at the table.
I mean, I may not know how OECD works, but I can tell you my lived experience with the Chinese. When I step off a plane in any African country, I see China. I see China in the railway. I see China on the roads. I see China in the biggest hospital. Visible infrastructure, energy that bring structural transformation to these countries. I mean, we've tried before to track how much we are borrowing from China, but at least we see the impact and the transformation in these countries. One thing that came out actually in the couple of regional meetings that I was telling you about development cooperation here in Africa, people were advising a global north partner, can you be like the Chinese? Can you just put your interests on the table? Because there is an interest, there is an agenda. Just be honest with it. That will allow us to also strategize what our interests are. We would not go blindly thinking that this is charity, this is solidarity, when we know it's not. Now that we're being called shithole countries, and the work is off, let's just be honest, like the Chinese. Not totally, they're not totally honest, but at least, there is something. So as I said, there is that impact that we see visibly, and also that there is that relative honesty in that partnership.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta. Sara, coming to you again, and Marta talked about, we've talked about how the conversation is now from donors to investors. And I mentioned the Global Gateway as one very visible example of that. And I was just wondering, Sara, from your point of view, why is that notion, through your research, why is that notion gaining so much traction in today's world, the capitalist view of, let's say, what development cooperation is about?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's because, well, and first, I just want to make a quick reaction to Martha. I have some reactions, but just one thing that I want to flag is that it's true that there is the OECD process going on, but it's not the only one. There's many processes right now on the table that are trying to discuss this question about what's the future of development. And, I can think of the Future Development Cooperation Coalition that actually, has views from, or representatives from Global North, Global South, China including, or you can also have the Accra Reset initiative, which I think it's really interesting, and it's driven by the southern countries, so African countries. So I think it's good to bear that in mind, also to have an idea of what are the different platforms that we can influence as we think through what's next, right? The OECD is not and should not be the only one, for sure.
Right.
So then back to your question, sorry about that. I think it's because we have, over the past years, we have been so focused on this narrative that we lack money, that we need money, that we're, we don't have resources, and we have such big global problems, and we have a gap to fill. So, what's the way to fill this gap? It's by mobilizing private finance. It's by becoming investors. And I think that's kind of that's a trick, that's a trap of a question, because I think what we need to focus on is using the resources that we have more effectively, and using these resources where we know they work. And as I said, obviously, there's many global challenges we need to address, but we need to use each instrument and each resource for what it's needed. And becoming an investor, moving from donor to investor is not the solution. I think although I think there is a good the instinct is not completely wrong in this narrative, as we heard from the panelists. There is a need to move away from just having cooperation based on aid. We need cooperation on technology. We need cooperation on trade, on investment and growth. And I think that's what a lot of partner countries have been voicing since the aid cuts. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to see aid just as part of a small puzzle with many different actors and different instruments that we can use to actually support this ownership and partner-driven development. I think that we should have. Yeah.
So outside the silo approach that often we do take in governance, don't we?
And for instance, sorry if I may, when we think about ownership, I think Martha also mentioned this. We normally think about ownership in the aid effectiveness, bubble, but ownership should be really about partner countries setting their own vision for how they want to develop and their economies and then be like, okay, we want these kind of partnerships with development partners, and we want these partnerships in trade, this is the investment that we would like to raise to develop our economy. So this, I think, to me, should be what the idea of ownership should be like. And there needs to be agency, because we talk about principles and rhetoric, but where is the capacities that partner countries need to actually drive this agenda, right? That's what we need, I think.
I would just argue that the World Bank, the EU, all of these organizations have been trying to do that for years, actually. But obviously, it isn't really enough. It's not really breaking the silos. It still keeps things in a very separate channels. But you're right. That's the approach that needs to be taken. I'm going to turn to Javier for the final question in this round. But meanwhile, just to say to all the participants that please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will take them in about 5 minutes, 3 minutes. So Javier, now that we've gone around and listened, taken the broader picture, also the micro picture, and come to certain conclusions about where we're headed, what, in your view, would a genuinely inclusive and accountable system of international development cooperation look like? What would be realistic about what we're looking at?
Thanks, Sara, for your question. I am not sure I want to be realistic, because I think that we need to go beyond
Visionary.
Yeah, that's it. So in a moment where we talk more about investment than poverty eradication or addressing inequalities, I think we need to be a bit radical in our proposal. So I think we need to talk about power in that system. So right now we know where the power is making, and who are behind making decisions for international development cooperation. So if I have to dream an inclusive and an accountable systems, I want to see the communities and right holders at the center of that system. I want to see women, young people, and marginalized groups in the debates, because I don't want only to see the donor governments at the table or national elites. I think that we need to democratize much more those spaces. I also want to see a system that focuses more on justice and solidarity rather than on charity. And it means included in the debate and in the analysis the structural drivers of inequalities. We have talked today about debt, tax systems, climate and justice. Those elements should be at the table and at the core of this accountable system. And that system should be locally led, should be feminist, and should be decolonial. I think Jean has mentioned before that we need to address that conversation, no? To what extent we reproduce some colonial patterns. So we need to include that as a key element of that system. And finally, talking about accountability, we are used to, focus the accountability in terms of upward and also financial indicators. So I think that donors, governments, NGOs, and multilateral institutions should be accountable to the people affected by the decision, and that should be at the core of that systems. And accountable means for the choices they make, the power they hold, and also the harm they could cause. So I think with transparency and independency, I think this system could be much more inclusive and accountable to the real objectives we want to achieve with international development cooperation. So back to you, Sara.
Javier. Yeah, thank you. Indeed, I think what you've said is very crucial. Locally led, feminist, and decolonial. I think these are very important concepts that need to be moved from the talk to the walk. And I think you're absolutely right. Matt, coming to you now for the questions and answers from our wonderful participants. Are there any that you'd like to put to our panel? Screen is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Shada. Actually, there are too many good questions. It's often possible to try to sift through and pick any over the others. But let me try to consolidate, I suppose, into a few different blocks.
Yes.
And I'll just cover them at once now. I'll basically consolidate, let's say, 4 blocks.
Okay.
So first, we've had a lot of questions that are focusing on this question of this idea of self-interest. Maybe it would be interesting to hear from many of the panelists that want to take this on, this idea of mutually beneficial partnerships, self-interest, and they take the one from Irene, which I think captures the this point that's been brought up by people. Self-interest has always been part of, I would say, development cooperation, not strictly EU development cooperation, but now it's being openly stated. Do we contest that framing, or do we focus our energy elsewhere and actually embrace the part that genuinely beneficial for both partners? So I think we can ask colleagues to answer that. There is also basically, how do we present the impact of the ODA cuts? There was a question directly to Marta, responding to her comment that, well, we haven't really necessarily seen the impact firsthand, but we do know that there are statistics show there is a major basically impacts in certain sectors, especially like the health sector. So is there, in linking this to the question of public perception, and what people think in the public about what aid does and what it doesn't do, is there a need to better show this, or demonstrate what the impact is of the aid cuts as a way to react and reverse the ODA cuts? There is also a very interesting question around leadership from the Global South. So essentially that LDC G77 haven't really spoken up so much in terms of defense of the ODA, or at least this is the impression publicly. The only place that we've really seen something is the Zambian president in the FT talking about that they no longer want to be dependent on aid. So what does this say about the future of ODA? And I would say there is a question around the global gateway. Do we start to embrace the idea of the global gateway, or not embrace, but what do we say about the global gateway's approach, which seems to perhaps promote the role of the private sector, commercial interests, as opposed to the sort of more traditional types of ODA that we're used to seeing? How do we respond to this? And then I would say there's a last one that just came in, which would have probably been a point that Gunjan would have raised, and Gunjan unfortunately wasn't able to join us, which is around the narrative. Do we still continue to focus our narrative around solidarity, humanitarian aid, saving lives? Or do we think about something much more radical or transformative, thinking about sovereignty, equality? I would say in some places we've been talking about reparations and rights-based development cooperation that's self-reliant and community-led. So I would leave it to the panelists to take on what they think they'd like to hear.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for all these very, very important and I think very pertinent questions. So I'm going back to the panel now, and just to very quickly go through them. There's the question of self-interest and mutual beneficial actions. Why are we not seeing the visible results of the ODA cuts, especially the American cutbacks? What about leadership from the Global South? What about the Global Gateway? And then finally, do we need to shift the narrative? So panelists, let me start in the same order that we had before. Jean, let me go to you first. Take the question you like. We have 20 minutes. So yes, succinct and to the point, please. I will also give the floor later to all the other panelists. Please, Jean, go for it.
Thanks a lot. We'll try to be succinct, and definitely very, very interesting questions, I think, on the top of everybody's mind. Self-interest. Well, actually, I think, Irene, you got it right. Self-interest has never been far away from the ODA equation. But I think now is the time to depart from that paradigm. That's what we are saying. We've seen what is bad about ODA for now almost 50 years. It has been driven by post-colonial relationships. It has been driven by self-interest, particularly in the last decades. That has become very, very obvious, but has always been the case. What we are saying is, let's go back to the original principles when ODA and 0.7 was set as this commitment by the international community. And for us, it was very much about reparations. And indeed, I suppose, responding to the question that another person had, we have to recast the narrative. It cannot be the old narrative about kind of a post-colonial hangover. It is about reparations. It is about justice. It is about breaking that extractive relationship. And that directly responds to our problem with the global gateway, because it is reinforcing an extractive relationship, which we said had to be ended, and which has been the core of the problem with ODA. So I'd say definitely justice has to be part of it. And we've seen, as Javier said, that citizens in many countries still believe that solidarity should be an important framing, and that should not be ignored. And finally, I think if you're talking about recasting ODA, it is about who is in the driving seat, as Marta said. And as Javier said, it has to be about not only sovereignty, but also about community-led. And I'm sure that Gunjan, if she was over here, would emphasize this point. It has to be about community-led agency, about who sets the rules and where they are set. So those are the crucial issues that need to be discussed in the current recasting of international development cooperation. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you very much indeed for answering quite a few of the questions in one go. Thank you very much. Martha, could we turn to you now, please?
Let me take what Gunel and MJ asked about, the visibility of this cuts, especially in the humanitarian and health context. So when I mentioned what the minister here in Ethiopia said, how come things did not turn upside down as we expected, I think she was talking about a sudden structural sectoral collapse, which did not happen. Okay, so that is the structural damage. But of course, as I said, when it comes to food security, emergency, reproductive health, there is impact on that. But I also would want to ask you, could it be that we've been coping with the unpredictability and instability of ODA? If you look at, for instance, 2025 with the HRP, the Humanitarian Response Plan, 2025, I think 14% of it was made. Yeah. 2023, I think 37% of it was made. So we've been coping with such unpredictability, the chronic unpredictability of humanitarian aid. But we're also forgetting that households have been coping using their own mechanisms. We tried to look at, for instance, in Somalia, 2009 and 2015, the hunger, how households in Somalia were coping, and the role of remittances. We keep forgetting that, because in our mind, we also think that there is that it's only the white man that can save Africans, So we need to also speak to reality and what is happening on the ground. I mean, as I said, it can be a lagged effect. We may see it. I saw someone commenting, we are going to see it in 2030, for instance, the health shock. I don't know, I've not seen that report. It could be. So it can be a lagged effect, but it can also be that the shock is more or less absorbed by inefficiencies and wastage of the sector. So this is something that is out there. If it is true, the latter, then it would be a huge indictment to the model that we've been running for decades. Thank you.
Marta, there was also, I think, a question that I'd like you to answer about Global South leadership on the issue. There was a quote about the Zambian president saying to the FT that they wanted to move away from a dependency on ODA. That was also my question to you earlier. We do not really hear very strong voices. At least we don't hear it here in the global north. And that may be because we're looking at the wrong newspapers. And I do agree with you that the FT is perhaps not the best barometer for what's happening in the global south. But inside Africa, is there voices that are enunciating, articulating what is really needed, as well as you have on a on a political level, on the global stage, you do it too, but on a political level.
Yeah, I mean, as Sara said earlier, there are conversations we are not aware of, reform talks, for instance, initiatives, and so on. I came from Nairobi, actually, last week from a AU-NEPAD meeting, exactly discussing this, the future of Africa, the future of development cooperation, moving away from being reactive to being strategic. So that is at AU level, for instance. But let's also remember that there are national initiatives, there are continental initiatives that are not putting aid as the center of their world. Look at Ethiopia, my own country. The World Bank refused money. The EU refused money. No donor was involved in building the largest dam that Ethiopia built. It's not through ODA. It's not through grants. It's not through loans. I, as a citizen, contributed. Civil servants contributed. And we built that dam. Okay? Ethiopia, as we speak now, they have set up emergency fund. So for every bank transaction that we conduct, for every mobile transaction that we conduct, they deduct so that it goes to the emergency fund, and that is for disaster risk management. So I just want us, to also think like there are initiatives outside of aid. Countries are doing something, but there is also conversation that is happening out there.
Thank you very much indeed for pointing that out. I think this is very important for us to know at a global level, but also especially in the global north, in global, in the EU as well, as we discuss our relationship with the global south. A very important point about the agency and the initiatives that are being taken on a national level, on a continental level, regional level, that we often overlook because our media, which is also quite biased, doesn't actually project those onto our screens or onto our newspapers. Thank you very much. Sara, would you like to answer some of the questions? And then I had one question for you also. For many countries in the global north, ODA was part of this soft power, right? So we're abandoning that because we think of ourselves now as more hard power countries, right? So just touch on that as well as when you answer some of the questions that I hear.
Sure. Well, and I just wanted to highlight, I encourage you to look into the Accra Reset Initiative that was it's led by the president of Ghana, by the Ghana presidency. It's a really interesting initiative that's coming from the global south to rethink the future of development and their sakes.
Brilliant.
So, yeah, I wanted to touch again on the idea of what's the narrative, and just I would like to restate my point that I think it's not only about solidarity, because then we may run into the problem that we're just governments are just not being truly honest on the whole picture of why they do development partnerships. So, but it's not only about self-interest, because then we're falling short of the narrative and we risk that, cutting aid might be way easier when domestic problems emerge at home. But it's really a mix. It's a really mixed picture of solidarity, addressing global challenges, and also mutual beneficial partnerships. And I just wanted to say, though, that there is a problem on mutual beneficial partnerships that I see, which is, first of all, we don't have really evidence or empirical records of whether these investments actually, deliver the development commitments, or if in fact it's just about, subordinating the development commitments to the provider objectives. So what do we really mean? What do governments mean by mutual benefit? Who sets the agenda, right? Like, that's really important. And I think right now that the rhetoric is way ahead of the evidence. So that's a problem. And then again, this mutual benefit narrative risks that we reopen the door to tied aid, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, opens the door to tied aid, then opens the door to maybe new forms of conditionality that are just dressed up as, partnerships. And that's a big risk. So yeah, I just wanted to
Thank you. Thank you very much. Javier, would you like to come in and maybe take up this issue of how we maybe, as Europeans, relinquishing quite an important soft power tool that we had if we move away to a more investor-based international cooperation rather than one based on development, solidarity, and justice?
Yeah, I mean, let me echo the words of Jean. I think that we need to start a conversation about justice and reparations. So that's the first element that we need to acknowledge. I mean, rich countries needs to be accountable for these commitments that they made long time ago. I think it's not the right time to question those commitments. And those commitments are based on a matter of injustice and unequal relations between the North and the South, and a relation that is based on extractivism. I think we need to challenge that. Saying that, when we talk about self-interest, whose interest are we talking about? Because to me, it's not the interest of the European citizens. Maybe it's the interest of a few. Maybe it's the interest of big, large corporates. So if we really talk about self-interest, let's talk about citizens' interests. So if looking at this from that perspective, we can think about what is the right role for the EU beyond the European Union with international development cooperation. Because what I feel is that when some decision makers are talking about self-interest, they are talking about private sector interest. And then they are looking into how we can make those interests mutual or whatever for the global south. So I think that we are sometimes trapped on that. I think that we need to question that self-interest concept, because I feel that we are trapped in a moment of offering only market-based solutions. You know, these market-based solutions don't deliver public services, don't reduce inequality, don't reduce poverty. So I think that we need to challenge that premise of, offer market-based solutions to resolve questions that require public money in form of grants.
Thank you very much indeed, Javier, and friends and colleagues joining us from across the world, and the panelists as well. Thank you so much for your very, very important insights and points of view. Just to wrap up from my side, I do write about these issues for several newspapers, and I also have my own advisory company. And I would say that, we shouldn't forget when we talk about this, about the geopolitical situation that we're facing at the moment as well. I mean, there's several war zones, several civil war zones, and of course, our economies are under pressure as well. So I think this is going to be an enormous challenge when we look at how our own societies are facing deep inequalities. The European Union has just brought out its own anti-poverty scheme as well. So the pressures for further reductions are going to be strong. And I think all of our friends here have noted the importance of having a very compelling narrative which goes beyond words and beyond rhetoric, but actually reclaims development cooperation as a tool for justice and not just leverage. We need a radical shift, because we live in one humanity and there is a chain of humanity. One suffers and so does the other. And I think that interdependence, that interconnectedness that we used to talk about 10 years ago, I think that reference is now being eroded. I think we've talked also about ensuring global South leadership, and not just token participation, but a really participation, a seat at the table, but a strong voice at the table. We've talked about resisting the quiet erosion of commitments that took decades to build, as Jean has pointed out. As Xavier talked about decolonial shift and also feminist-led reform. And I think the most important thing that we've talked about is how we need to come up really with a narrative that brings all our ideas together, because the citizens of the global North and the citizens of the global South are aligned on the fact that solidarity is the way forward, because we face so many common challenges, the climate being just one of them, but also poverty and civilian disasters across the world. So thank you to all our speakers and to the organizers for organizing this very important conversation that I think will be disseminated on several channels. And I think Stephanie can come in and just tell us where exactly we can tune in if we miss this, or if we need to come back for reference. So thank you very much to everyone who joined today. Let's give them a virtual applause. And thank you very much indeed for joining us. Stephanie, do you want to come in now?